Whatever you want. I believe we are live. Now I have to wait for, do we have any kind of echo going on? My audio good? Because I'm
not sure.
You're not sure? Wait for, do we have any kind of echo? Now we got an echo. Yeah.
There we go.
That was an echo.
That answers that question.
Yeah, anyway, okay. Because I'm on my main speakers, I don't have the headphones on today. Because we're not going to really play any video. It's only when I play video that I have a problem. Yeah. So anyway, the idea here is, I guess what I want to find out about is, so the whole point of this is to start to look at DNA as information, or DNA as a code, or biological information. So that's kind of the point. And the point is to get our terms right. And one of the things I noticed the other night when we hung out is that when you talked about, when you talked about information, we were talking past each other in that, I'll show you here. I have this thing that, okay, we've got, like, if you imagine finding a chunk of metal with copper and iron atoms, right? Mm-hmm. We have this like collection of copper and iron atoms here. I'm not sure. Okay, now you can see my cursor, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I can distinguish it.
Okay, and now they're different, But you'll notice something about this, a little illustration. I call this a yin and the yang of difference and similarity, because those are clustered in a certain pattern. So even though the patterns are randomly apart, so there's something random about the information at the same time that there is something similar about it. There's this thing about structural information in space-time that has patterns of similarity, and that is what I was calling information. But you were calling it, information a description of this, which would be a human thing, right?
No, I would say it's an abstract thing.
Well, abstract, but human, sort of. But how?
I guess. I mean, it's something humans utilize, if that's what you mean. But
yeah, okay. So you think abstract has its own category in the world, but how do you hash that out?
I think what you're describing here, I mean, like the spatial orientation of copper around iron atoms, like the notion that things in space can orient themselves differently in time. I think space and time themselves are abstract concepts. Like those are parameters by which all of the parameters take form in.
Okay, so what is an abstract concept? Is it an ontological thing separate from humans? What is it?
I'd say it's something like beyond people. Time and space continue to persist even if we don't.
Yeah, and so do these patterns. So that's kind of the point I was making, is that they have nothing to do with humans. There's something about nature. There's something about the way the atoms, the way every piece of matter is put together in the universe, that is, you could call it order, or you got to call it something. What are we going to call it? The way things are put together.
Yeah, my thing is that I think the type of thing you're describing, like with the different spatial orientations of copper and iron, those are things that might exist independent of reality. But if we're dead, if we don't have any sensation.
Well, I don't know if you wanted to say independent of reality. I mean, those things are real.
Independent of our perceived reality, I guess, then.
Independent of what?
Independent of our perception, I suppose.
Right, our perception of reality. Yeah, those things are out there no matter what. And DNA, the code, is out there whether we know about it or not. I mean, it has been for however many, 700 billion years, or probably 3 billion years. So it's been out there, and it is organized in a certain order. It's something beyond just random admixtures of chemicals. It's more structured than that. It has more of something in it that I call information. But if you don't like that, then I could call it something else, like order.
I'm not sure something necessarily. So, my perspective on DNA and things like that is, I'm not sure I would consider DNA to be something special in terms of its structure or how it interacts with other molecules.
Well, that's interesting, because Roederer in his paper, Pragmatic Information in Biology and Physics, he talks about two distinct categories of information. I introduced the concept of interaction between material bodies as a primary concept. So he's considering what I'm talking about, interaction of two physical bodies as a primary concept. Two distinct categories can be identified. One, interactions which can always be reduced to a superposition of physical interactions, forces between elementary constituents. And he's talking about simple chemistry, right? But then he makes a distinction of two, interactions between complex bodies which cannot be expressed as a superposition of interactions between parts, and in which patterns and forms in space and time play the determining role. In other words, he's saying that where things are in structure, this higher structure is more important. And I don't agree with him that those are two distinct things.
Yeah, I would say that's borderline arguing from ignorance. Because it could be it. So my thing is, it might be the case that the rules like that govern DNA and how it's transcribed and translated can be described by some set of physical laws which just we don't know about currently. Because I agree with Dimitri on the aspect that it's most likely that like the set of amino acids in the ribozyme evolved in conjunction like with the composition of DNA itself, or RNA actually in this case. So I think at some level they're inherently connected to each other, but that's a very complex physical theory that's not readily explained by quantum mechanics.
Well, I think what he's talking about is that in life, the arrangement of these of all of the atoms inside of a cell, the arrangement becomes more important than the individual interactions that we're talking about. We can focus on one individual interaction, like reading the codon by tRNA, but overall for life, we're looking at something that is much more complicated structurally than, say, a mineral, because it's reading that code and it's creating a phenotype. I mean, it does something far kind of in excess, and that is what Roeder is calling pragmatics. That it does something a little bit more than your average chemical bear, you know?
Yeah, it responds by like in terms of expressing phenotypes.
Yeah, and he has a statement in here: the lack of a widely accepted definition of pragmatic information that is truly objective, unrelated to any human or use or practice. So he's trying to define pragmatics as pragmatics without intelligent design, without any intelligence at all. And that's what he's coming up with. Now, the case I was making, let's see, where did I have it?
Well, I guess the first question I would have is like, is it even appropriate to describe, like to try and insist that there should be a universal definition for information? Like that they're, I guess, say, is there a reason that information can't be hierarchical in nature?
Oh no, there isn't. But we're trying to focus on understanding biological information. So let's see this slide. The only way two thinky things can interact is physically. That's something people forget. Like we have one little feely thinky thing talking to another one, which is me and you.
Yeah.
Somebody like you, but we're talking through a physical medium. So the point that Wills makes in his 2015 paper for the Royal Society, I think it was Wills. No, you refer to some Kunin. I'm not sure. The point they make is that it's always physical. I mean, there's something that's always physical about information. It always has a physical embodiment. And my thing is that we humans have this little nut in our cheek that we want to keep thinking about how it's all about us. It's always about us. Well, I'm trying to get around that and go to an abstraction. I'm trying to abstract away from that. So you have this, that little smiley face in the upper right, if you're looking at my screen, is looking at objects in the universe. But what we try to do for understanding biological information is we necessarily have to step outside of ourselves, outside of all of us, and start making abstract, there's your word. Basically, we take a God's eye view of what everything is, including us, and how we perceive information. So basically, we're stepping outside of ourselves. That's what we attempt to do in science.
Isn't that making the assumption that the observer isn't part of the system they're trying to study? I mean,
no, it is. I'm saying it is. We're studying the observer. But for the most part, when we're talking about biology, we know that no observer is involved in how you turned into, how you went from a zygote to you, did not have an observer.
Yeah, that process is entirely chemical.
Entirely chemical, ultimately physical. So the problem we get into is if we claim that there has to be a reader of the information, then they can claim there has to be a writer. So I'm calling that a Immutable's dilemma. From the other night, I'm sorry, I named it after you. If you insist, that information can't exist unless there's an observer, they can insist on the other side of that coin that it can't exist without a writer.
So I guess my perspective is that information exists whether we're there to observe it or not, but only discernible information exists.
So we agree.
Yeah, so only discernible information exists in the presence of observers.
Yeah.
And like the example I was raising, like of a green ball living in a world of red balls. The green ball, under the assumption it can't observe itself, would essentially live in a vacuum. It can't observe anything except its own environment. But a red ball that can observe other things can both see red balls and green balls. It can observe more than, like, it can distinguish between itself and its environment.
Okay.
And the thing is, like, for us, it doesn't make sense to, like, if we didn't exist, right? So, like, if there's no sense of, like, sensation or sensory perception, it would be valid to say that there's information, but it wouldn't be sensible, like, to try and describe what that information is.
Well, there'd be nothing to describe it. I mean, we're the describer.
Yeah.
But in order to,
essentially what would happen is there's no reference frame, like, to act as a basis for comparison.
And my point is always that if we keep confusing ourselves, if we keep dipping back into that and looking at what, including ourselves as observers of the information, we end up with a category error where we keep going around in circles. So the only thing we can do if we want to have a sensible discussion about the physical universe is to take the God's eye view, where you cannot talk about the gods. We just assume that we can abstract away from all, and look at reality from the outside.
I would say that, in a sense, we have to treat reality as if though it's observer independent.
And then if you look, but no, Immanuel Kant, I believe his Kantian categories, he was insisting that we can't do that we could never get at the noumena. But then other people like myself would insist that we can asymptotically approach taking a pure God's eye view of the universe. And there is something about the universe, even if that little cube is not exactly a cube, there's still something about the universe where one thing is closer to another thing than it is to a third thing, So what we're trying to do is we're trying to get at Kant's noumena conceptually, and I think we can do that with mathematics. So,
yeah, I think so. I mean, because mathematics doesn't seem to require an observer at all.
Yeah,
it just seems to require abstract principles that build on each other in a very consistent way.
Yeah, and I'll always insist that those abstract principles always start from our fundamental ideas of mathematics always began in the physical universe, that it's some description of the physical universe, even though we can take it way beyond that. I mean, we can come up with geometries that have, that are way beyond whatever physicality is.
Yeah, I mean, you can always get into like the philosophy of mathematics, but I don't think it's a valuable topic.
Yeah.
I think they're useful as conceptual notions. Like the notion of nothingness, like the idea of zero, I don't think it's something that actually exists.
Yep.
But I think it's something that's like valid in terms of the conceptual framework.
Whoops. What did I do? So information is where things are in relation to other things. That's what I call information. We could call that something else. Space is real. What you are is one of those things. We always have to, try to step outside of ourselves. If you want to talk about the inner world of subjective, then leave physics out of it. If you want to understand what space is or the things in it or biology, then you leave the subjective the hell out of it. So that's just saying no to category errors. So when people start talking about their mind and consciousness, they frequently go back and forth between a subjective realm and an objective realm. They're trying to be objective about being subjective at the same time as they're trying to be subjective about objectivity. And you end up going in circles. And that is what I don't like. So kind of what I was all about. I'm going to try to share a paper. Oh my goodness. The mouse just disappeared. I wish I had a decent handle on I've got to get OBS Studio working to the point where I can stream people. But let me see here. There's a paper by that Royal Society. The Royal Society has a rich set of papers. I don't know if you've looked at any of them, but Will's 2015, he kind of does an overview of DNA as information. And I got to try to find the paper. I shall look. So I think we're pretty much in agreement. It's just I like to keep it separate. So looking at a strand of DNA as information, what it seems to have done is that sequence of information has recorded the history of that particular lineage all the way back, right?
Yeah.
Which is kind of spooky. So we have 2016 generation of meaningful information.
Well, part of that, though, remember, is that the reason it's done that is because it's had chaperones, essentially, like in the form of proteins, to essentially preserve its structure, to prevent it from mutating it, to prevent it from changing overly much.
Yeah, I mean, there's like, oh God, which paper was it? They said the more we find out, the more complicated this. I think Roeder makes that point that, standing for truth, he's always talking about the trajectory. We only understand 1%. Well, we understand a lot more than that.
Yeah, it's a lot more.
And let's see, an information-driven interaction. Let me see. I'm trying to find. Yeah. I got to go through the papers a little more carefully. This one, I kind of have some marks on. Wills, DNA as Information by Peter R. Wills. Let me try to share that. Our application window. Where are you, Peter?
Yeah, I think to the earlier point we were discussing about like DNA and its like capacity as storing as an information storing molecule. I'm not sure I would immediately like be willing to say that that's a unique property of DNA.
Yeah, there could be many, many others. This paper, Will's, has some pretty good stuff in it.
Yeah, I think it probably got favored due to the chemical composition of the Earth and certain conditions that made it more stable than other things. But
yeah,
like, is it unique in terms of its electronic and structural properties? I'm not sure.
Yeah. Let's see. These in terms of DNA. Okay. So he makes the point that, can you read that okay on the screen?
Let's see.
These rolls of DNA do not find any chemical explanation in terms of the average material properties of DNA as an irregular heteropolymer. So basically, they're saying that it also depends on the sequence of that DNA. So
yeah,
it's a more complicated form of chemical. To say it's just chemicals bumping into each other, and that's what the creationists say. They're going to insist that this structure does not exist, and we're not denying that this structure is a little different than just mixing sodium and chlorine together, right?
yeah.
And it's more complicated because it's done in the cell and it's done in space and it's done temporally over time, so it's much more complicated. But I thought that was a highlight. The conclusion that the DNA in organisms functions as information, and that is right here. This drives us immediately, okay, to the conclusion that it functions as information, and that the internal DNA-independent dynamics of cells embody functional information processing, that is computation. Can you see where John Maddox gets his whole dialogue?
Yeah.
Yeah, because these are papers, I think. I don't think he downloaded all of these papers, but he has a few of them. I think this might be one of them. It would be interesting to find out which ones he does have, and more interesting to find out which ones he did not choose to keep.
I think what's important, though, and I think Demeter would probably agree with this, is that this is a co-evolutionary process. I don't think...
Yeah, that case is made somewhere down here in this stuff. This is an overview of all the different writers that they have.
Okay.
Information matter dichotomy. Okay, this I should have went through and highlighted. I don't know. Maybe it would pay for us to read this paper and all get together and discuss it, and then I could highlight things and we could talk about this particular paper, because there is a lot in here. He's got references to everybody's different approach. Like he mentions Kunin on page 3, is it? Where does he mention? Oh, right here. Okay, he mentions Kunin's take on it. And that was the paper that Walker and Molecular and I went over and created our 2-hour monstrosity that we still haven't gotten edited. But
yeah,
we talked too long, I think. And then he goes on and he talks about Roederer right here. And Roederer has this idea, the meaning of information is Roederer's important point. So he goes over that, and that is another paper. And Roederer also talks about epigenesis as being an important part of how we decipher the complexity of this information. My point on DNA being a history of the lineage is that the DNA is modified, obviously, all the way back to the common ancestors, or the common population is what I like to call it. And it records a history of the environment that entire lineage has been subjected to. And it records that history through natural selection. And it's entirely mechanistic. None of these guys agree with the Maddox that there has to be a designer. There isn't anything in this entire Royal Society chapter on intelligent design.
Yeah, because that's not the point they're trying to make.
No, they're talking about how we're going to deal with DNA as information and how we're going to use mathematics to understand how cells work. And then there's
what these people are trying to do, it seems like, is they're trying to massage Shannon information into such a form that it can be used to create mathematical models for abiogenesis.
Yeah. Here's Barbieri. He has a number of papers. And Wills has a few more papers. One of the papers that Wills has is about abiogenesis, I believe. A couple of these guys make a real strong, let's see, okay. D. Giulio, that the first mRNAs co-evolved with peptidated RNAs that catalyzed their own synthesis using base pairing patterns that were more than 3 bases long. Which is kind of interesting. So they're suggesting
idea.
What's that?
It's really similar to Demeter's idea.
It is, yeah.
Peptides and RNA.
Yeah, that's the thing. I found a lot of stuff that I think Demeter would like in these papers and agree with, but he was pretty harsh about, nobody having really looked at it the way he's looking at it. So it'd be interesting to talk to him about that.
Yeah, I think what he's arguing for, if I'm remembering his papers correctly, is he's arguing that the evolution of the amino acids, and specifically codon assignment, was due to the fact of, number one, obviously not codon availability, amino acid availability, but also because of how small peptides would interact with nucleotide strings.
Yeah, and how this entire information structure built itself. And there's another paper where they get into that, and that that $10 million prize.
Yeah.
For coming up with it. There's papers in here where they allude to. They don't talk about that prize because I don't think it existed at that time, but they do talk about methods about how that happened, how this thing built itself. And so this would be a nice paper to start with. And I think all four of us have to tackle each of these papers and start looking at information. At least it's something I'm obsessed with. I don't know about you guys.
The other thing too is do you ever get around to watching like the lecture series on abiogenesis that I gave you guys?
Was it a series?
It was a series. It's still finishing up, but it goes over a few important concepts, like how mathematical models are formulated in terms of like how to determine like the optimization for like an intake for cell nutrients and things like that. And to me, what seems readily obvious is that chemical structure will have a bearing on how optimally information is not how information, but how chemical structure essentially will have an influence on how optimally resources can be transferred back and forth between cells, or how quickly chemical interactions can be catalyzed. So the mathematics, I think, at some point creates a dominance in respect to the question of what types of chemical systems would have been the most prominent in abiogenesis systems.
Yeah, I think there were thousands of systems initially, and one path was chosen. Basically, one path hashed out. I think there was a lot of it.
Well, I think part of the selection barrier for that became, number one, the composition of certain protocell systems may have only been could have only been sustainable in high temperature situations. So, while the Earth was still on fire and burning.
Yep.
Once the Earth cooled to room temperature, it could be that only a very small or a very fractionated section of the overall, variation could replicate on its own or replicate somewhat efficiently.
Yeah, it built stable subcells.
Yeah, and then
as it cooled, and only a very few of those actually survived.
Yeah,
a stable pattern.
And in the same sense, you also can argue that for mineral uptake in terms of like the chemical compositions of certain lipid bilayers or things like that. And I think that's kind of the way you kind of need to start thinking about chemical systems. About, okay, yes, there's a ton of chemical systems, but how do these chemical systems pertain to the ability of a protocell to replicate efficiently? Because even if something replicates efficiently and it takes a long period of time, it's going to be won out by replicating systems that are quicker, but don't have as efficient as a fidelity rate in terms of maintaining their the integrity of their genetic information.
So I have a 7-inch high stack of papers that are related to the Royal Society and the things that they refer to. That is going to take some work. But I've got Abel. Okay, you remember Abel, David Abel?
Yeah.
He doesn't. Royal Society didn't admit him, but there is a paper by him. Complexity, self-organization, and emergence. There's Adami, what is information? There's Ball, the problem of biological information. Bunch of papers by Barbieri, Marcello Barbieri on biosemiotics, and it goes on and on and on. There's Barbosa, not to be confused with Barbieri.
Yeah, I think the main question of information that probably these papers are trying to address is the question of what's the origin of information in context with the genetic code.
Yep. There's
How
one.
How do you explain like certain properties DNA has in terms of its chemical composition and other compounds that react with it or interact with it, rather?
Yep. I found this paper or article by Bodden called Deep Down Things and What Ways is Information Physical and Why Does It Matter for Information Science? It's kind of a neat read. Brawley, Molecular Linguistics, and we got a bunch of stuff to do. But anyway, I just wanted to kind of settle out like calling information physical and explain what I mean by that is is where things are located in space and time and how those things would affect a biological cell.
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously more complicated than just molecules bumping into each other. And that's what fucking kills me about the whole the creation is constantly saying random chance. It was random chance maybe for the first 35 milliseconds. And after that, it became a matter of structure and information from then on. And that information has been a 4.2 billion year story about how that information.
I would say it's probably random up to like the first, I don't know, 100,000 or so years. But after that, once you have a diverse enough pool of chemicals to work with, then it really becomes a matter of different elements of chemistry and physics in terms of how well these chemicals, obviously, how well are these chemicals stabilized in their environments? How well do they hydrogen bond with each other? How well do they undergo van der Waal interactions? Are they stable? Are they not stable? Various things. I mean, there's a million things under the sun to consider with those types of systems. But yeah, like the random chemistry aspect of it.
Well, as soon as it started forming itself into cellular microstates, where clusters, however those clusters happened, created their own microenvironments, that is where the information started to self-generate from one thing to another. But how many different kinds of cellular microstates were there? In which
right.
Anyway, Otangelo is having a thing on James Tour, and was it Professor Dave tonight or something?
I don't know.
Yeah, he's doing it at 7:30. So Otangelo is going to, I don't know what the hell he calls it, taking Professor Dave down. But that'll be interesting. Okay, I'm happy.
Okay.
I think we can end this and just chat a bit offline, and maybe all four of us can gather together and go over paper at a time after paper after paper after paper. I had paper after paper after paper, and none of them say intelligent design. What the fuck?
Oh, but that doesn't mean intelligent design isn't part of the equation.
Yeah. Right. We just missed it because we're hate theists and we just want to hate.
Yeah. The thing is, like, why would I hate something I don't believe in to begin with?
I know. I mean, it's like the Bible. They're going on and on about and a lot of atheists do attack, slavery in the Bible and contradictions. I don't give a rat's ass. I'm not going to read their parchment. I don't care. I don't care if they have I don't know.
I really could care less about, a misogynist, that claims protection under Christianity. I really could care less.
Yeah, the way I look at it, those Christians, when they are, I mean, if they feel sexual stimulation, because they saw somebody from whatever sex that they're interested in, then somehow they have to talk about it. But the only way they can talk about it is in terms of sin and lust. So they necessarily have to find other people to judge. But what Smokey did and what those guys did is they sat and they had a good old boy backslapping booby fest where they're talking about women like objects, but they did it in such a way as to make themselves seem superior. And that is fucking ridiculous.
Yeah, the thing is, like, Smokey makes it sound like he's entitled to something.
Yeah.
Like, that's like, oh, women should be in the kitchen. Women should be, constantly sucking me off, whatever.
Yeah, they have to cover up. Yeah. And he said as much last night. And it's like, oh, there's women they have to cover up. Well, why the fuck do they have to cover up? Why can't you handle seeing somebody that you may be attracted to? I mean, it is your fucking problem if you are sexually stimulated, not theirs.
I think it ties back to scripture again, because the Bible says this thing about if you've looked at a woman with lust, like you've adulterated her, and like you've raped her, like adulterated her, like in reality or something. It's bizarre.
Yeah, but they blame the woman.
Yeah, it's just
what the fuck.
Yeah, the Bible takes very clear anti-feminist stance in terms of just like fuck women, and women like should be subservient to men
and cover them up and sell them.
It's like,
what is it, 50 shekels? Is that what a daughter's worth?
Could be. I mean,
I was on Jay Spatchcock's one of his live hangouts in the middle of the night, and he had I forgot his name, an economist on there, and he was trying to explain to me what a shekel meant. And it's relative apparently to the town you're in, and how many sheep you have and stuff like that. It's pretty interesting, because I wanted to know how much is 50 shekels in today's dollars, and he said basically a nonsense question. So I don't know, but it was interesting. I had a good talk with Jay and a few others there. It's pretty. Anyway, we can end this one. I think we don't want it to go too long. It's one of these little information shots. And we'll talk a little bit about what we can do with this mess of papers I have after I end, okay?
All right.
So we're ending.